Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that every struggle in your life, every physical ailment, every moment of confusion and pain stems from a single horrifying truth, one that isn't even your fault. You realize that your trembling hands, your difficulty breathing, your clouded thoughts, all trace back to decisions made before you were even born. Your parents, driven by an obsession with keeping bloodlines pure, have condemned you to a life of suffering. You discover that your mother is your cousin, your father is your uncle, your grandmother is also your great-aunt. The family tree doesn't branch. It's a twisted vine choking itself in its coils. You are not the product of love, but of a calculated breeding program designed to preserve power and wealth with no regard for the human cost. This isn't fiction. This was reality for countless women throughout history, trapped in a web of genetic destiny that they never chose. Before diving into the forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing to Story Walls for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about European royalty. These aren't fairy tale princesses living happily ever after. These are real women who paid the ultimate price for their ancestors' obsession with genetic purity. Women whose bodies became battlegrounds where politics and biology waged war, and biology always lost. Their stories have been hidden for centuries, dismissed as medical curiosities or royal embarrassments. But today, we're going to give them the voice they never had. And trust me, what they have to say will haunt you long after this video ends. For centuries, European royalty believed that marrying within their bloodlines would preserve their divine right to rule. They saw their blue blood as literally different from that of commoners. Purer, more sacred, blessed by God himself. What began as a political strategy evolved into a dangerous obsession, creating a genetic nightmare that would echo through generations. The Habsburg family of Austria and Spain perfected this art of self-destruction. Their family motto might as well have been, "Let others wage wars." You, happy Austria, marry. But their marriages weren't happy. They were calculated genetic disasters that produced some of history's most tragic figures. By the 16th century, European royal families were essentially one massive interconnected web of cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and siblings producing children who would rule empires. What they couldn't understand, what science would reveal for centuries, was that they were writing a genetic death sentence for their descendants, creating a legacy of suffering that would ultimately destroy the very bloodlines they so desperately sought to preserve. To understand these women's stories, we must first understand the twisted logic that created their suffering. The concept of divine right wasn't just political theory. It was religious doctrine. Medieval manuscripts show kings literally touched by God's hand, their authority flowing directly from heaven. This divine selection extended to their very blood, which nobles believed was fundamentally different from that of commoners. The term blue blood, sangre azul, originated in Spain, where aristocrats with pale skin could see their blue veins, unlike darker-skinned Moors or Jews. This visible difference became proof of their genetic superiority, a physical manifestation of God's favor. The nobility didn't just think they were better than commoners. They believed they were a different species entirely, closer to angels than to ordinary humans. This delusion would have catastrophic consequences, as they sought to preserve this heavenly essence at all costs. By the 15th century, European royal families had created a complex web of alliances through strategic marriages. Watch as these lines crisscross the continent, each representing a union not of love but of political calculation. Spain connects to Austria, Austria to France, France to England, creating a tangled network of bloodlines that would eventually circle back on themselves. These weren't just marriages, they were living treaties, human collateral in the game of empire. Children, particularly daughters, became commodities to be traded for peace, territory, or influence. Their bodies and genetic futures were sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition, with no consideration for the biological consequences that would follow. As these connections multiply across generations, notice how the web becomes denser, the lines overlapping until entire regions of Europe are bound together by blood. Among all royal houses, none embrace the strategy more completely than the Habsburgs. Originally minor Swiss nobles, they rose to control an empire through marriage rather than conquest. Their unofficial motto, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry," wasn't just clever rhetoric. It was their blueprint for world domination. But look closely at their family tree. By the 16th century, it no longer resembled a tree at all. Instead of branching outward, the lines curve inward, creating loops and circles where straight lines should be. Each loop represents cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, creating a genetic echo chamber where harmful recessive traits would amplify with each generation. The Habsburgs weren't just marrying relatives occasionally. They were doing it systematically, generation after generation, creating what geneticists would later call the most dangerous family planning strategy possible. The contrast couldn't be more stark. On the left, a healthy family tree branches outward, bringing in new genetic material with each generation. On the right, the Habsburg family wreath curves inward, recycling the same genes repeatedly. This visual isn't just a metaphor. It's a genetic reality. With each inbred generation, the Habsburgs were reducing their genetic diversity by approximately 25%, creating a biological time bomb. By the time we reached the later Habsburgs, their inbreeding coefficient was higher than what would result from a brother-sister marriage. Charles II of Spain, the dynasty's final ruler, had an inbreeding coefficient of 25%, meaning his parents were genetically as closely related as a father and daughter. The consequences were devastating. Physical deformities, mental disabilities, infertility, and a host of genetic diseases that would create unimaginable suffering for generations of Habsburg women trapped in this biological nightmare of their ancestors' making. Our first story takes us to Vienna, 1634. In the shadowed corridors of the Hofburg Palace, a child is born who will never know a day without pain. Maria Anna of Austria enters a world with a Habsburg curse already written in her genes, the result of generations of cousins marrying cousins, of a family tree so tangled it resembles a noose. From her earliest memories, Maria Anna knows she is different. While other children run and play, she struggles to walk. Her spine curves unnaturally, forcing her into a hunched posture that makes breathing difficult. Her jaw protrudes so severely that she can barely eat solid food. Servants must cut her meat into tiny pieces, and even then meals become exhausting ordeals of careful chewing and cautious swallowing. Court physicians document her condition with clinical detachment, measuring the curve of her spine, the protrusion of her jaw, the weakness in her limbs. She becomes not a person but a case study, a living example of what happens when genetics go wrong. But Maria Anna's physical struggles pale beside the psychological torment of understanding why she suffers. She grows up surrounded by portraits of her ancestors, and in each painted face, she sees echoes of her own deformities. Here an uncle with the same protruding jaw, there a grandmother with the same curved spine. She realizes with a terrible clarity that only comes with suffering that she is not unique. She is the latest victim in a long line of genetic catastrophe. The palace physicians with their bloodletting and their prayers can offer no relief. They whisper among themselves about the Habsburg curse, but never in her presence. To her face, they speak of mysterious ailments and God's will, never admitting the truth that everyone knows but no one dares speak, that her suffering is a direct result of her parents' and grandparents' obsession with keeping their bloodline pure. Maria Anna spends her days in dim rooms, curtains drawn to hide her from the world and the world from her. The loneliness is perhaps worse than the pain. Potential suitors, all of them also her cousins, recoil when they see her. Marriage negotiations begin, and then quickly once her condition becomes known. She remains unwed, not by choice but by circumstance. Even in a world where cousin marriage is normal, her deformities are too severe to overlook. The irony is crushing. The very practice meant to make her more marriageable has rendered her unmarriageable. The palace becomes her prison, its grand halls and ornate chambers shrinking to the few rooms where she can move comfortably, where servants won't stare, where visitors won't be subjected to her appearance. Her world contracts year by year as her condition worsens, until her existence is confined to a handful of rooms in the vast imperial palace. Yet within this physical confinement, Maria Anna's mind soars. She learns to read voraciously, her sharp intellect one of the few parts of her body that functions properly. In books, she finds worlds where bloodlines don't matter, where people marry for love instead of lineage, where children aren't born carrying the sins of their ancestors in their very bones. She becomes fluent in 6 languages, masters mathematics and astronomy, corresponds with scholars throughout Europe. Her letters, written in an elegant hand that betrays no hint of her physical struggles, reveal a woman of extraordinary intelligence and sensitivity. In one poignant passage, she writes, "My body may be a prison built by my ancestors, but my mind remains free to wander where it will." This intellectual escape becomes her salvation, the one aspect of her life where the Habsburg curse cannot reach her. Maria Anna dies young. At 32, her body finally surrenders to the accumulated weight of genetic damage. Her death certificate lists various ailments, but the real cause is never written down. She died because generations of her ancestors chose power over humanity, purity over compassion. Her funeral is sparsely attended, her achievements quickly forgotten. No grand monument marks her grave. No epic poems commemorate her suffering. She becomes a footnote in Habsburg history, one more casualty in the dynasty's march toward genetic oblivion. But look into her eyes in the only portrait that survives. There's a knowing there, a wisdom born of suffering. She understood what her family refused to see, that their obsession with blood purity was slowly killing them all. She died because of a family tree that didn't branch. From Austria, our story moves to Spain, to perhaps the most tragic figure in this dark tapestry. Joanna of Castile, known in history as Juana la Loca. Joanna the Mad, born in 1479 to Isabella and Ferdinand, the Catholic monarchs who expelled Jews and Muslims from Spain and funded Columbus's voyages. Joanna seemed destined for greatness. Instead, she became a cautionary tale about the price of keeping bloodlines pure. Joanna's madness wasn't apparent in childhood. She was intelligent, educated, fluent in multiple languages. Court records describe a lively, curious girl who excelled at music and dance, who questioned her tutors with such insight that they sometimes struggled to answer. But the seeds of her destruction were already planted in her genes. Her parents were cousins, part of the same interconnected web of European royalty that had been marrying within itself for generations. The first signs appeared after her marriage to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, a union arranged to strengthen political alliances. The real tragedy began when Philip died suddenly in 1506. Joanna's grief transformed into something darker, more obsessive. She refused to allow his burial, traveling across Spain with his coffin, opening it regularly to kiss his decomposing corpse. Contemporary accounts describe how she would sit beside the open casket for hours, stroking his hair, talking to him as if he could still hear her. At night, she would sleep with the coffin beside her bed. The image is horrifying, but it speaks to a deeper truth about her condition. She had been so isolated, so deprived of genuine human connection, that even death couldn't break her attachment to the one person who had shown her attention, however cruel. Witnesses reported that she would fly into a rage if any woman approached the coffin, convinced that even in death, other women might steal Philip's affections. Her behavior shocked Europe. But was it truly madness, or the extreme manifestation of grief in a mind already fragile from genetic damage? Her father, Ferdinand, and later her son Charles V used her supposed madness as justification to lock her away. For 46 years, nearly half a century, Joanna lived in confinement in the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. The conditions were deplorable. She was kept in dark, cold rooms, given minimal food, and denied basic hygiene. Her attendants reported that she would go weeks without washing, that she would tear her clothes to shreds, and that she would scream for hours at a time. Visitors were forbidden. Letters were intercepted. Her children grew up barely knowing her. The woman who should have ruled Spain and its vast empire instead became a prisoner of her own country. Her existence reduced to a handful of rooms in a provincial convent. The dynasty she should have led used her as a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when women step outside their prescribed roles. But here's the crucial question. Was Joanna really mad? Or was she driven to madness by her circumstances? Modern historians increasingly believe that her madness was largely political, a convenient excuse to remove a legitimate queen from power. Her behavior, while extreme, can be understood as a natural response of someone suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, exacerbated by decades of isolation and abuse. The genetic component cannot be ignored. Joanna's family tree shows clear patterns of mental illness, depression, and anxiety, conditions that become more common and more severe with inbreeding. Her great-grandmother had similar episodes. Her daughter, Catherine, would later show signs of severe depression. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. What we're witnessing isn't supernatural possession or divine punishment, as her contemporaries believed, but a predictable outcome of generations of genetic damage combined with extreme psychological trauma. Joanna died in 1555, still imprisoned, still officially mad. Her death was barely noted. She had been erased from public memory decades earlier, written off as an inconvenient madwoman, rather than acknowledged as a victim of a system that valued political convenience over human welfare. In her final years, she reportedly found some peace in religious devotion, spending hours in prayer in the small chapel attached to her rooms. But the woman who should have ruled an empire died alone, her potential squandered, her suffering unacknowledged. The true madness wasn't in Joanna's mind. It was in the system that created her, then punished her for being its perfect product. Her story reveals how madness has always been a convenient label for women who become inconvenient, especially when their inconvenience stems from the very genetic inheritance their families forced upon them. Our next story unfolds in the golden halls of the Spanish court, where a little girl named Margaret Teresa carries the weight of empire in her frail body. Born in 1651, she is the daughter of Philip IV of Spain and his niece, Mariana of Austria. Yes, his niece, because by this time, the Habsburg family had become so inbred that uncles routinely married their brothers' daughters, and no one saw anything unusual about it. Margaret Teresa's childhood is documented in exquisite detail through the paintings of Diego Velázquez, court painter to the Spanish kings. In these masterpieces, we see a child who should be playing with dolls, but is instead dressed in elaborate court gowns, her small face already showing the telltale signs of Habsburg genetic damage. Look closely at Velázquez's portraits, and you'll see what the artist was too diplomatic to emphasize, but too honest to hide completely. Margaret Teresa's jaw protrudes slightly, just enough to hint at the severe deformities that will become more pronounced with age. But the most tragic aspect of Margaret Teresa's story isn't her physical condition. It's her complete lack of agency over her own life. From birth, every decision about her future is made by men who see her not as a person, but as a political tool. She is promised in marriage to her uncle, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, when she is still a toddler. The engagement is celebrated across Europe as a diplomatic triumph, with no one stopping to consider what it means to the child at its center. Margaret Teresa grows up knowing that her only purpose is to marry her uncle and produce heirs to continue the Habsburg line. She receives the finest education available to women of her time. She learns to speak several languages, to play musical instruments, to dance, and to paint. But all these accomplishments are viewed merely as ways to make her a more attractive bride to her uncle husband. Her childhood becomes a countdown to the moment when she will be sent to Vienna to fulfill her reproductive destiny. The marriage takes place in 1666, when Margaret Teresa is just 15 years old. Leopold is 26, old enough to be her father, and is her father's brother. The wedding is celebrated with elaborate ceremonies and public festivities. But for Margaret Teresa, it represents the end of whatever childhood she had left. The physical reality of her marriage is something that court records hint at but never explicitly describe. Margaret Teresa is expected to produce children immediately, despite her young age and frail health. The pressure is immense. The continuation of the Habsburg dynasty depends on her ability to give birth to healthy heirs. She does become pregnant multiple times, but the results are tragic. Her first child, a daughter, lives only a few months. Her second pregnancy ends in miscarriage. When she finally gives birth to a son who survives infancy, the relief at court is palpable, until it becomes clear that the child has inherited the full spectrum of Habsburg genetic problems. Margaret Teresa herself grows weaker with each pregnancy. The combination of inbreeding-related health problems and the physical strain of constant childbearing takes a severe toll on her body. She suffers from what modern doctors would recognize as severe anemia, respiratory problems, and possibly epilepsy. Court physicians document her decline with clinical precision. They note her increasing difficulty with speech, her frequent seizures, her inability to keep food down, but they never connect these symptoms to the obvious cause, the genetic damage caused by generations of inbreeding. Instead, they prescribe increasingly desperate remedies, bloodletting to balance her humors, herbal concoctions to strengthen her womb, prayers and religious relics to ward off what they see as spiritual afflictions. Nothing helps. With each pregnancy, more of her life force drains away, sacrificed to the Habsburg obsession with dynastic continuity. Margaret Teresa died in 1673, just 6 years after her marriage, at the age of 21. Official records list the cause of death as fever, but the reality is that her body simply gave up under the accumulated weight of genetic defects and physical trauma. Her death is mourned throughout the empire, but not for the right reasons. Courtiers and diplomats lament the loss of a potential source of heirs, not the tragedy of a young woman whose life was sacrificed to preserve a bloodline that was already poisoned beyond redemption. In her final portrait, painted shortly before her death, we see a woman aged far beyond her years. Her eyes hold a knowledge of her impending death, a resignation to the fate that was written in her genes before she was born. The artist captures something else too, a quiet dignity, a refusal to be reduced to merely a victim of her circumstances. Even as her body failed her, Margaret Teresa maintained the grace that made her beloved by those who knew her as a person, not just as a royal broodmare. Our journey now takes us to the glittering court of Versailles, where behind elaborate ceremonies and magnificent architecture, 2 Habsburg women, separated by more than a century, would face the consequences of their genetic inheritance. First, Anne of Austria, born in 1601, daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, yet another uncle-niece pairing that was considered not just normal, but desirable among European royalty. In 1615, at age 14, Anna is married to Louis XIII of France as part of a complex diplomatic arrangement. The marriage is meant to cement peace between Spain and France, 2 powers that have been at war for decades. What no one considers is the psychological impact on Anna herself, torn from everything familiar and thrust into a foreign court, where she is expected to immediately adapt to new customs, a new language, and a new role as queen. Her husband, Louis XIII, is cold and distant, dealing with his own psychological issues. Their marriage remains unconsummated for years, adding to Anna's isolation and anxiety. Anna's first several pregnancies end in miscarriage or infant death, each loss adding to her depression and anxiety. The court physicians, following the medical understanding of their time, blame Anna for these failures. They subject her to increasingly painful and humiliating treatments, bloodletting, purging, bizarre dietary restrictions. They examine her intimate areas regularly, looking for signs of what they call defects in her feminine nature. No one considers that the problem might lie in the genetic inheritance she received from generations of cousin marriages. After 23 years of marriage, Anna finally gives birth to a healthy son, the future Louis XIV, the Sun King. A second son, Philippe, follows 2 years later. But the physical and emotional toll of her years of suffering cannot be undone. Anna remains a deeply anxious, depressed woman who finds little joy even in her eventual success as a mother. Her later years are marked by increasing physical problems, digestive issues, respiratory difficulties, and what court doctors describe as melancholy attacks that leave her bedridden for days at a time. A century later, another Habsburg woman would walk the halls of Versailles. Marie Antoinette, born in 1755, daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. While Marie Antoinette is remembered primarily for her role, to fully understand these women's stories, we must examine the genetic science that explains their suffering. What exactly happens when closely related individuals reproduce? The answer lies hidden in our DNA, the molecular blueprint that determines everything from the shape of our jaw to the chemistry of our brain. Every human carries harmful recessive genes, genetic mistakes that could cause serious problems if expressed. In a healthy, genetically diverse population. These harmful genes remain dormant, masked by normal dominant genes inherited from unrelated parents. It's nature's fail-safe system, ensuring genetic mistakes don't manifest. But when cousins marry cousins generation after generation, as the Habsburgs did for centuries, this protective mechanism breaks down catastrophically. With each inbred generation, the chance of inheriting two copies of the same harmful gene, one from each closely related parent, increases exponentially. This isn't just bad luck. It's mathematical certainty, a genetic time bomb ticking louder with each cousin marriage. Geneticists measure this risk using what's called an inbreeding coefficient, essentially the probability that a person has received identical genes from both parents due to common ancestry. In a random marriage between unrelated individuals, this coefficient is effectively zero. First cousins who marry have an inbreeding coefficient of 6.25%, meaning their children have a 6.25% chance of inheriting identical gene copies from both parents. This might seem small, but when cousin marriages happen repeatedly across generations, these percentages compound dramatically. By the time we reach Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg ruler, his inbreeding coefficient had reached a staggering 25%, higher than what would result from a parent-child or brother-sister union. Look at how these Punnett squares change across generations. With each inbred generation, the red squares indicating harmful gene combinations multiply until they dominate the genetic landscape. The Habsburgs weren't just playing with fire. They were systematically removing every genetic safeguard evolution had built into human reproduction. The most visible manifestation of this genetic catastrophe was the infamous Habsburg jaw, technically called mandibular prognathism. This condition, where the lower jaw outgrows the upper jaw, became the dynasty's unmistakable trademark. Watch this progression across 2 centuries of portraits, from the slight underbite of Maximilian I to the severe deformity of Charles II, who could barely close his mouth or chew solid food. This wasn't just an aesthetic issue. It was a painful disability that affected breathing, eating, and speaking. Modern medical analysis suggests the Habsburg jaw resulted from a specific pattern of recessive genes affecting facial development. With each generation of inbreeding, the likelihood of inheriting 2 copies of these genes increased, making the condition progressively worse. By the dynasty's final generations, this once minor trait had become so severe that it constituted a serious disability, with some Habsburg descendants requiring liquid diets because they physically couldn't chew. What began as a barely noticeable family resemblance evolved into a debilitating deformity that marked its bearers as victims of their ancestors' genetic hubris. But the visible deformities were just the surface manifestation of much deeper genetic damage. Modern genetic analysis suggests Habsburg descendants also suffer from increased rates of epilepsy, intellectual disabilities, and a range of psychiatric conditions. The high incidence of depression, anxiety disorders, and psychotic episodes that plagued royal women wasn't just a reaction to their difficult circumstances, though those certainly contributed, but had biological roots in their compromised genetic inheritance. Brain chemistry is heavily influenced by genetics, with conditions like clinical depression often linked to specific gene combinations. When inbreeding increases the likelihood of inheriting 2 copies of genes associated with mental illness, the result is a family predisposed to psychiatric disorders. Joanna of Castile's madness, Marie Antoinette's mood swings, Anne of Austria's melancholy attacks, all could be understood as manifestations of genetic vulnerabilities triggered by environmental stressors. These women weren't inherently unstable. They were carrying the accumulated weight of generations of genetic damage that affected their brain chemistry in predictable, devastating ways. Perhaps most tragically, the fertility problems that affected so many Habsburg women can also be explained by genetics. Successful reproduction requires an extraordinarily complex sequence of genetic interactions, from egg development to embryo implantation to fetal growth. When genetic diversity decreases, the likelihood of incompatibilities that disrupt this delicate process increases dramatically. The high rates of miscarriage, stillbirth, and infant mortality in Habsburg bloodlines weren't due to medical ignorance alone, though 17th century obstetrics certainly didn't help. They were the inevitable result of genetic damage accumulating over generations. By the dynasty's final years, Habsburg women faced a cruel paradox. Their primary value lay in their reproductive capacity, yet their genetic inheritance made healthy reproduction nearly impossible. The system that created them had simultaneously created the conditions that would ensure its own destruction. Nature, it seems, has built-in safeguards against extreme inbreeding, safeguards the Habsburgs spent centuries trying to circumvent, until biology finally enforced its rules through the ultimate penalty, genetic extinction. What makes these stories even more tragic is how the system perpetuated itself despite overwhelming evidence of its harmful effects. Royal courts had extensive records documenting the health problems that plagued inbred bloodlines. Physicians wrote detailed reports cataloging deformities, mental disorders, and reproductive failures. The connection between cousin marriages and health problems was obvious to anyone willing to see it. Yet the practice continued unabated for centuries. The Catholic Church, which prohibited marriages between relatives for commoners, routinely granted special dispensations to royalty. These official documents, signed by popes and bearing elaborate seals, effectively sanctioned genetic destruction in the name of political expediency. The Church's position was that royal bloodlines were divinely ordained, and preserving their purity was more important than preventing human suffering. In one particularly disturbing case, Pope Urban VIII granted a dispensation for Philip IV of Spain to marry his own niece, despite clear evidence from court physicians that their previous dynastic marriages had produced children with severe deformities. The spiritual institution that should have protected the vulnerable instead became complicit in their suffering. Court physicians documented the consequences of inbreeding with remarkable accuracy, given the limited medical knowledge of their time. They noted patterns of inheritance, tracked family traits across generations, and even made connections between cousin marriages and specific health problems. In 1649, the royal physician to Philip IV wrote a confidential report warning that continued marriages between close relatives would lead to degradation of the royal line and eventual extinction. His warnings were ignored. Instead, the report was sealed in the royal archives, and the physician was instructed to focus on treatments rather than causes. Political considerations always trumped medical advice. Marriage contracts were negotiated by diplomats and ministers whose primary concern was territorial advantage, not genetic health. These contracts, some spanning dozens of pages with elaborate provisions for dowries, territories, and succession rights, contained not a single mention of health considerations. The human beings whose bodies would bear the consequences of these arrangements were reduced to interchangeable pieces on a geopolitical chessboard, their suffering a mere externality in the pursuit of power. The economic incentives for continuing these destructive marriages were enormous. Royal families had accumulated vast wealth and territory that they were desperate to keep within their control. Marrying outside the family meant risking that wealth might eventually pass to foreign hands. By keeping marriages within the extended family network, they ensured that property and power remained consolidated. The Habsburg Empire, spanning from Austria to Spain to the Americas, was built and maintained through the strategy of genetic self-destruction. Each marriage contract represented not just a political alliance, but a financial transaction, with dowries, land transfers, and trade agreements all carefully negotiated. The human cost of these arrangements was never factored into the equation. When Margaret Theresa was sent to Vienna to marry her uncle, the marriage contract included provisions for Spanish territories in Italy to be transferred to Austrian control. Her body was literally traded for land. The system treated these women as commodities, their reproductive capacity a resource to be exploited until it was exhausted, regardless of the physical and psychological toll. Perhaps most heartbreaking is how the victims sometimes perpetuated the very system that destroyed them. Having been raised to believe that their royal blood made them superior to commoners, some actively sought marriages with their own relatives to preserve what they saw as their genetic inheritance. They didn't understand that they were participating in their own genetic destruction. In a letter to her daughter in 1570, Catherine de' Medici wrote, "Nothing could give me greater joy than to see you married to your cousin. Our blood must remain pure, untainted by common stock." The daughter she was writing to would later die in childbirth, trying to deliver a severely deformed infant who couldn't survive outside the womb. These women were both victims and unwitting perpetrators of a system that valued bloodline purity over human welfare. They've been so thoroughly indoctrinated into the ideology of royal exceptionalism that they couldn't see how it was killing them and their children. Their letters reveal a tragic disconnect between their lived experience of suffering and their continued belief in the necessity of the very practices causing that suffering. The pain never leaves me. Even in sleep, I feel my body betraying itself. Maria Anna of Austria, 1652. For children I have carried, for children I have lost. Still they demand more from my broken body. Margaret Teresa, 1671. They call me mad because I refuse to forget. They call me mad because I refuse to pretend. Joanna of Castile, 1538. The physicians examine me like a brood mare, discussing my failures before me as if I cannot hear. But I hear everything. Anna of Austria, 1634. My daughter was born with the family jaw. I pray daily that she forgives me for what I've given her. Marie Antoinette, 1778. They celebrate my pregnancy as a triumph for the dynasty. None see it for what it truly is, another sacrifice on the altar of family pride. Maria Josepha Bavaria, 1767. These voices, silenced in their time, speak across centuries with devastating clarity. They knew they were suffering. They understood at some level that their pain was connected to the family's obsession with bloodline purity. Yet they remained trapped in a system that gave them no agency, no escape, no alternative but to endure until their bodies finally surrendered to the accumulated weight of genetic damage. Their words reveal not just physical suffering, but the deeper psychological trauma of knowing you are valued only for what your body can produce, even as that production slowly kills you. Return with me now to that moment of terrible realization we imagined at the beginning. Waking up to discover that your entire life has been shaped by decisions made before your birth, by ancestors who value bloodline purity over human welfare. For the women whose stories we've explored, this wasn't imagination but daily reality. They live with the knowledge that their physical pain, their mental anguish, their reproductive failures, and their social isolation all stem from the same source, a genetic inheritance poisoned by generations of inbreeding. They carried not just their own suffering, but the accumulated weight of centuries of poor decisions made by people who should have known better. Yet in their pain, we find something profound about human resilience. Despite their circumstances, many of these women found ways to assert their humanity. Maria Anna became a scholar, finding intellectual freedom in a body that imprisoned her. Joanna maintained her fierce love even in madness. Margaret Teresa bore her suffering with dignity. Anna found solace in faith. Marie Antoinette faced death with courage. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can find ways to assert its worth. As we reach the end of these tragic stories, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The suffering of these women served a purpose, though not the one their tormentors intended. Their pain, documented in court records and medical texts, provided crucial evidence for the development of modern genetics. The Habsburg genetic experiment, horrific as it was for those who lived through it, gave science invaluable data about the consequences of inbreeding. Modern understanding of recessive genes, genetic diversity, and hereditary disease patterns developed partly from studying the tragic outcomes of royal cousin marriages. This doesn't justify their suffering or diminish the horror of their experiences, but it does mean that their pain wasn't entirely meaningless. The knowledge gained from studying their condition has helped prevent similar tragedies and has contributed to our understanding of human genetics. Every genetic counselor who helps families understand hereditary risks, every medical researcher studying rare genetic disorders, every couple who can make informed reproductive choices, all benefit from knowledge purchased with Habsburg women's suffering. Their unwilling contribution to science echoes through every genetics textbook, every prenatal screening, every family planning consultation that helps prevent the repetition of their tragedy. The women we've discussed, Maria Anna of Austria, Joanna of Castile, Margaret Teresa of Spain, Anne of Austria, Marie Antoinette, and the countless forgotten infantas, were real people who lived real lives filled with real suffering. They weren't just historical footnotes or genetic case studies. They were daughters who dreamed of different futures, wives who longed for genuine companionship, mothers who wept over children born to die. Their letters reveal women of intelligence, sensitivity, and deep emotional capacity trapped in bodies and circumstances that betrayed them at every turn. They understood art, literature, and science. They wrote poetry, composed music, and engaged in theological debates. They had favorite foods, cherished pets, secret hopes, and private fears. In short, they were fully realized human beings whose humanity was systematically denied by a world that saw them only as breeding stock for dynastic ambitions. Today, as we light these metaphorical candles of remembrance, we restore to them the dignity they were denied in life. Each flame represents not just a tragic story, but a complete human life that deserved better than the fate genetics and politics conspired to give it. Their legacy is both tragic and redemptive. Tragic because their suffering was preventable. Had their ancestors chosen love over lineage, health over wealth, their stories might have been very different. Redemptive because their documented suffering has helped ensure that such systematic genetic destruction will never again be pursued in the name of racial or class purity. While royal inbreeding on a Habsburg scale is largely extinct, the forces that created these tragedies persist in different forms. Isolated communities worldwide still practice cousin marriage, often with similar genetic consequences. More broadly, women continue to face pressure to sacrifice their health and autonomy for family expectations, cultural traditions, or economic necessities. The fundamental tension between preserving tradition and protecting human welfare continues to play out in various contexts around the world. The Habsburg women's stories remind us that whenever we prioritize abstract ideals, whether bloodline purity, cultural tradition, or family honor, over individual human welfare, we risk creating new variations of their tragedy. Their voices, silenced by death and time, still carry urgent warnings about the cost of treating people as means to an end rather than as individuals deserving of dignity, choice, and compassion. In the end, their message is both simple and profound. Remember us not for our royal titles or our political significance, but as human beings who deserve better than the fate that genetics and politics conspire to give us. Remember us and learn from our suffering so that others might be spared the curse of keeping bloodlines pure. Their eyes, gazing at us across centuries, ask not for pity, but for recognition. Recognition of their humanity, their suffering, and their unwilling sacrifice to scientific knowledge. They paid the ultimate price so that we could learn a lesson their ancestors refused to see, that human worth cannot be measured by bloodline, and that true nobility lies not in genetic purity, but in the courage to acknowledge our common humanity. As you leave this story, carry with you not just the horror of what was done to them, but the strength they showed in enduring it. Let their resilience inspire us to challenge systems that devalue human life, wherever we find them. And above all, remember them as they were, not symbols or statistics, but women who loved, suffered, hoped, and died, leaving behind a legacy written in both pain and progress. These women's voices were silenced for centuries, their stories buried in dusty archives and forgotten palace records. But you have the power to change that. Right now, in this moment, you can help ensure their suffering wasn't in vain. Every view, every share, every comment helps bring their stories out of the shadows and into the light where they belong. If this video moved you, if you felt anger at the injustice, sorrow for their suffering, or admiration for their resilience, then I need your help to reach others who need to hear these truths.